All right. Today's lecture 2, is on UMTS services and applications. So last week, if you were able to make the lecture, we were covering an introduction to 3G mobile communication. So you should be able to get the lecture notes from online if you happen to miss the class. So today what we're doing is we're taking it one step further and looking at what we can actually use 3G for. As I mentioned last week, we use the terms 3G, UMTS, and wideband CDMA in this lecture series interchangeably. So they all essentially mean the same thing. So to start off with just a quick review of the course outline, you did see this last week, but we are at lecture 2. And just a quick overview, we'll start off with the general introduction in the first few lectures, and then we'll start to get more into the deeper layers of the technology in the middle part of the course. So after the midterm break, so the physical layer, traffic management, signaling, those sorts of things. And after the tutorial break, we will look more beyond 3G as it is today. So beyond HSPA or HSDPA, the evolution of that, and heading towards long-term evolution or LTE. So just a quick recap on the course there. So what will we cover today? It'll be 4 key areas. The mobile multimedia marketplace is what we'll start off with. So what exactly is mobile multimedia? What does it look like? Potentially also, where is it going? I'd be interested to hear what you think as well. So we'll have a little discussion on that if possible. Some examples of multimedia. What does it look like again today? And more importantly, what we see going forward with multimedia is the charging aspects of it as well. So what I mean by charging is the billing to the actual customer. Previously, you were billed for voice, or currently I should say you're billed for voice and SMS, and it's fairly straightforward. But if you're sending pictures, videos, downloading TV clips, how should you be charged? Should you be aware of the cost structure for each particular type of service? That would be very complicated. So we will have a discussion on that as well. And then finally, we will discuss the IMS or IP multimedia subsystem architecture and the standardization of that. So IMS, if you like, for 3G or wideband CDMA is almost like the service layer part of the network. So last week we looked at the radio access network, and then above that was the core network, and the next layer was the service layer or application layer. So those 3 layers are important to remember. So essentially this whole lecture is about the application layer, or the service layer as we call it. So moving on, what is multimedia all about? Well, there's no real strict definition. I could start off by saying that. I guess it means different things to different people. But there's a few common areas where one could all agree upon. The first is it's about your device. The multimedia device is actually quite key going forward. As I talked about last week, we have a generic mobile phone, but now we have video capability, text, speech, the whole works. And in some point, I think also now some manufacturers are looking at voice to text conversion, for example. So you won't need to type in your SMSs anymore or provide commands to your terminals. You'll be able to talk to it, and then the phone will actually activate whatever service and application you want. So that in itself is a multimedia application, if you want to call it that. The second part is the applications and content. Last week we looked at the service providers and what role they play in the new telecoms world. If you recall, we talked about the consumer and its relationship to the operator, which is a traditional relationship, if you like. And now we have the third player, which is the service provider like Google and Yahoo and 9MSN and all those sorts of players. So sports, news, music, TV, gambling, games, all sorts of things like that. And probably the most important part actually is it's fine, I guess, if you like to have a connection between you and the operator and potentially one other party. But what we're seeing more and more in the, shall we say, the evolution of the internet and multimedia is the interaction of communities. So if you take MSN chat, Yahoo chat, Facebook, MySpace, all of those sorts of things, we're really discussing communities. As users and people and humans and societies, we like to to have a bond with various groups, whether they be friends, colleagues from a work context, or professionally. So these communities are starting to become quite important. So with multimedia, we're also starting to bridge the gap now with communities as well, and create a lot of new groups. So what we are able to do on fixed line internet, for example, when you're at uni or at home on the internet surfing on Facebook, for example, ideally you'd love to do that on your mobile phone if you're an active user. You don't really want to be restricted just to your ISP connection or your ADSL connection. So those sorts of easy-to-use type interfaces need to come onto the phone at the moment. So if we take an example, the iPhone is a good example. It has YouTube built into it, so you can click the YouTube icon, and it takes you straight to various content, which is very easy and quick to load if you've had the experience. So that sort of ease of use is going to become very important with the services that are about to be launched. But I think also with the YouTube connectivity, when you go outside of that icon and you start to surf the web directly, then it's quite a cumbersome approach to search and find and look for movies and so on. So there's quite a lot that needs to happen in the back end when it comes to the delivery of the content to the mobile device in this context. So the content providers, how they render the content, how they format it for your particular mobile device versus somebody else's mobile device. And that same content should actually be able to be delivered to a PC as well. Ideally, it's the same content. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in being able to be compatible with all of the types of devices that we have out there today. It was a much easier proposition with voice and SMS because all phones had exactly the same capability and the same standard, if you like. So delivering SMS from one phone to the other was a fairly simple case. So what does it look like going forward? And I always use voice and SMS as a baseline because that's what we're used to. It's a fairly essential service now for all of us. So if we look at the services beyond voice, what are they? We're starting to see a merge in the industry. Before we used to call it the merge of telecom and datacom, or the internet. But that didn't really manifest itself all that much. But what we're seeing now is more like a triple play of merging, if you like. It's the telecom, the internet, and the media industry as well. So what I mean by media is broadcast TV, pay TV, content channels, Foxtel, all of that sort of stuff. European Premier League, whatever it might be. So how is the telecom, which is our traditional voice and SMS service, merging with the internet, if you want to use that as the definition of data? That's already been happening for several years. And how will then media play a role in all of this together? So what we're seeing is this triple play, if you like, of services coming together. So underlying all of these services then is the actual technology that we're looking at. And you can spend a couple of minutes just looking at just a refresh on the evolution of 3G. Some of you might be familiar with this already, but we can have a quick look at that just to see where we've actually come from. So the 2G technologies that we're quite familiar with, the first one, of course, is GSM, and that has a very large subscriber base of around 3 billion or so. The older 2G technologies like TDMA, which was quite common in the Americas and some parts of Asia Pacific as well, were quite prevalent. And then we had PDC, which was a 2G technology that was only ever in Japan. So we migrated from those technologies by adding a packet data service, which was GPRS, which for the first time gave us somewhat reasonable data rates. So we've gone from a very slow modem-like feel of 28 kilobits per second from anywhere starting at 20 to 64 kind of kilobits per second with GPRS. GPRS was supposed to hit 100 kilobits per second, but it never really did that. It was a bit too expensive to launch a GPRS network with that kind of data capability. So in effect, what really happened in the markets around the world was GPRS was only really providing typically 20 to 40 kilobits per second. That was the real data rate. So that was obviously slower than good dial-up at 64 kilobits per second. So it wasn't really an interesting proposition from a mobile data point of view. But you still had connectivity, so it wasn't too bad. The only services then, if we go back to the services that you could get access to were portals, like web portals. I don't know if any of you remember trying to configure your phone for a web gateway or a web portal to get some sort of a browser service. Some examples of that are Vodafone Live, for example, where you could click the Vodafone button and you'd go straight to a web page, and then from there you could access news and movies and information and all that sort of stuff. But the problem that happened in the industry was that most operators felt that when you access those portals, that they should be charging you access for it. So every time you downloaded a page, you were bringing, several hundred kilobits per second down to your mobile phone. At that time, in the early stages, they were charging per kilobyte, several cents, maybe 10 or 15 cents, whatever the number was. So if you were just simply surfing these web portals, you could end up with, hundreds of dollars worth of data calls at the end of each month. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if you're just simply playing around and you're spending a couple of $100, that you're going to stop that behavior. So what really happened then was the mobile portals themselves didn't really take off. What they hoped was that you'd be browsing these portals, you'd see a content item that you liked, you'd click on the link and you'd download the movie, and you'd pay $5 for the movie, for example, which could be movie clip, which could be 30 seconds long, but then you'd also be paying for the data transfer as well. So the movie clip could be 300, 400, 500 kilobytes in size. So again, you're starting to pay a significant amount of money for stuffing around, so to speak, which again didn't fly very well with consumers. So where things changed was finally large operators cottoned on to the fact and said, all right, then we'll give you free access to our portal. So then you started to be able to browse, and then data usage started to move. But the problem of paying for per click type services again was a big question for consumers. How much are you really willing to pay? I asked you last week, how much would you pay for a TV service? And someone said, I think it was $3 or some number like that. So it didn't really take off. But what I'm describing to you is what we call a walled garden approach to the internet service provider context, if you like. So these large telecom operators like Vodafone and say Deutsche Telekom or AT&T and so on, and NTT Docomo in Japan, they all wanted you to click on their website in their data network on their content servers, basically, because they wanted to get the revenue for themselves, which is reasonable. But if you think about the type of internet behavior you and I are all used to, it's very much around surfing the internet from home. We have open access. We can click on any website we like, and we don't pay anything on from those websites. So that open free access kind of paradigm, if you like, that we're used to wasn't replicated on the mobile phone to start off with. So we're not used to that kind of cultural behavior. So I think that was probably one of the biggest problems the mobile operators faced. They assumed that because they own the relationship with you as a subscriber, as a consumer, they could take over and capture all the revenue. And of course, that didn't start to happen. Now what we have is two types of network accesses. The first is that walled garden approach that I talked about, where you're restricted in terms of the internet and where you can actually surf, hence the walled garden. And secondly is the open access internet, where a mobile operator would give you access to an open internet pipe and then you could surf as you wanted. So if you take a market like Australia, it only takes one mobile operator to offer open access, and that becomes a very compelling proposition. And all those other operators who had a walled garden, of course, no one's going to use that anymore. So in many markets around the world, you started to see this walled garden being opened up, if you like. But at the same time, operators were very reluctant to open up this walled garden. So what they said was, we'll open up services, what we call off-net. So a walled garden is what we call on-net, so that's on the operator's network. And services off-net were actually somewhat restricted as well. So for example, they might have arranged or had a commercial agreement with Google so that you could access their map service and restaurant guide service, for example. So although you're not on the operator's network, you're accessing third-party content providers, but still within some kind of framework of the traditional operator. It's not truly open access. Of course, companies like Google would love to have all subscriber networks open access, so that they have a direct relationship now with the mobile subscriber, and the operator is what we call a dumb pipe or a bit pipe. So this bit pipe type commercial arrangement is the problem that a lot of the operators will face, because the only thing that they will see in terms of revenue would be the monthly charge that you pay them, and they won't see any service or application layer benefits. So what are the areas where we can actually start to see some new areas developing are fairly obvious, I would say, in many instances. The first one, of course, would be music, which is a very big area, and the whole iTunes concept and downloading phones and singles to your well, not actually mobile device, really. It's more your PC or your iTunes player on your laptop, for example, or your home PC. And then you upload it to your iPod, and then off you go. That is a fairly well-established practice in many markets around the world. There's some examples in the UK. You might all remember a company called Napster. They were quite famous for file sharing, and then they ended up getting sued. But they actually have a legitimate business, which is quite large. They actually had then decided to sign up a lot of licensing agreements with a lot of the big record labels. So I seem to remember a plan they had maybe over a year ago where you could pay £15 per month and you'd have access to 6 million songs on their library. And you could download as many songs as you want in that month. So quite a compelling proposition there. You don't have to worry about how much you're paying every time you're downloading a song. You know you're paying £15 a month. Very simple, easy commercial model between you and the content provider, and off you go. So that was music. It's quite likely we'll see that with media or video. Whether we'll see feature-length movies on our phone will be another story. I mean, of course, watching a movie on a small TV screen on your mobile phone is probably going to give you some eyesores as well. So the type of model you were looking at here would be quite different. Maybe we're actually watching sitcoms, 20 minutes long, or even shorter than that. Maybe they're 3 to 4 minute clips. And if you look at the type of behavior while you're on the go, you're waiting for a bus or a train or in between meetings, you might want to preview some business content or entertainment content. So I think that the type of style of media will be very different on the mobile device versus what's available on PCs and laptops, for example. The next is TV. Mobile TV really is what we're talking about. TV in the home, TV on the phone. And the big one, of course, then is finance and news and just general media information. So in terms of finance, we're talking about stock tips and reports and all those sorts of things. Up-to-date live information on the go. So all of these services at the end of the day, which is what I would call at the very top level, they all need to be delivered by various basic services. So those basic services would be, for example, a pure voice bearer, for example, potentially SMS. We see examples of basic SMS services where you get notification from banks of PIN numbers, for example, or you're walking past a shop and you get, hey, we've got a special on. There's another area called premium SMSs where you could pay anywhere between $3 and $4 and $5 for an SMS. For example, voting on Big Brother and those sorts of types of shows. Chat could be an underlying mechanism as well. And then MMS is potentially another underlying service that can deliver some of those higher level applications that we talked about. There's probably one aspect on here that is, on this particular slide, that is missing. And if you look at our communities discussion that we had in social networking, one of the most important parts of that is presence information. So what I mean by presence is, if you take MSN Messenger, for example, you can see who's online. You know whether they're away, be right back, leave me alone, I'm tired, or those sorts of things. Also, you might be able to provide information on where this person is, for example. At home, in a meeting, out shopping, don't bother me, talk to me in 10 minutes, those sorts of details. So that's what we call presence information. So, for example, some of the use case scenarios that we look at, people want to go catch up for a movie, They look at their mobile device, they see who's online, who's free that night, and you send a generic message to all of those people on your buddy list. And you don't spam everybody, you just send it to only those people who have said, yes, I'm willing to do something. And then you have an interaction with all of those all of your friends, for example, on that buddy list, and then off you go to the movie. We've got an example in the slides later on in the lecture that shows you two friends who are trying to meet up for a coffee or go for a movie. It's an interesting case. So moving on, talking again about these new ways of communicating. Voice, text, image, video. Drawing is another one that I haven't mentioned so far. For example, what you see on your phone, you can actually use a stylus to draw on, and the other person sees the same sketch. And that becomes quite useful in providing directions for people on maps, for example. And just general file sharing as well. If you take the business applications, many business consumers or users, for example, would love to have to be able to update all their files and then upload it to the servers while they're on the go. So that whole community coming together, both for commercial purposes in a business environment, as well as just for you and I as friends to muck around and for entertainment, is going to be an interesting scene going forward. So if we look at our mobile phone now, I think it's fair to say that it's not just a phone anymore. So what is our mobile phone really capable of doing? It's a highly integrated device that offers SMS, text, gaming, videos, emailing, which we can do a lot of nowadays, instant messaging and chat. I guess with chat and instant messaging, it's a bit cumbersome to have a discussion over the mobile phone because of the small keyboard. So that hasn't really taken off in a big way. One area that had taken off for a little while was something called push-to-talk. Push-to-talk on a mobile phone service was very much like a CB radio. You press one button on your mobile phone, and everybody who's connected to you can actually hear what you're saying at the same time. So it was very, Sprint Nextel in the US was one of the operators that launched that service, and it actually took off quite fast. So they used it as an add-on to mobile data and their speech services that they had on mobile phones. It has a good following, if you like, within the trades industry with building and trucking and those sorts of companies where they're able to keep in touch with many of their colleagues at the same time. So moving on, if we look at the trends in the mobile device, because now what we're seeing is, we talked last week a lot about the speeds of a mobile network. How fast can it go? Where can I get my coverage? In the next couple of years, what is the mobile network going to do? But at the end of the day, it really comes down to the mobile device capability. What sort of features and functionalities are in that device? So to start off with, when data really kicked in 2G and GPRS, it was really only the web browser, as I mentioned, that was actually of any interest. And otherwise, there were very basic services, as we all know, the alarm clock and time and all those fairly essential items. Eventually, the WAP protocol, the wireless application protocol, which was what was building these web pages, improved. It got a bit faster. The protocol itself was actually quite badly designed. It was what we call had a high amount of chatter, meaning the signaling between the device and the web server was quite intense. So to set up a web page on a web portal was quite time consuming. So if you get a service that the page takes 5 to 10 to 15 seconds to load up, you start to get very bored, and then you're more likely to stop using the service. But the big development that happened in the phone, of course, was the camera. Once the camera was included, already at that point in time, of course, color screens were available. Then things really started to take off. But the big thing that I guess you might all notice, I'd be interested in your feedback, is although you might have a camera phone with a lot of memory on the phone, you're taking lots of pictures of friends at parties and clubs and wherever it might be, but the photos are still staying on the phone, aren't they? I don't know how many of you actually go and connect your phone to your laptop and download your pictures from your phone. Does anyone do that? Oh, we have one game user here. So, so one out of an entire room here is quite a low proportion when you think about it. So do we really have multimedia today? We talk about all the great things that the mobile phone can do, but the only thing we're really doing is we've added a camera essentially to the mobile device. What you would really like to be able to do is to share and exchange these photos in a very easy way. It proves to be probably quite cumbersome to do it at the moment, and also, of course, very expensive. So I assume you're connecting your phone to your laptop or your PC, right? And you're downloading your pictures from that. But if you were able to do it while you're on the go and you'd be able to upload your photos from your phone to another friend's phone, for example, that would be something I'm assuming you might be interested in. As long as you weren't paying too much money for it, right? $3 a month or whatever it might be, right? So what stopped us from doing that? Is anyone got any ideas? Why aren't we able to upload all these photos easily? Well, why hasn't it happened yet? We've got all these big companies around the world spending money on networks and building new phones. Someone just took a photo in the class. Why do you think that might not be happening? Well, let me give you a clue. I mean, this is just ideas. There's no correct answer as such. The first thing that you need to have is a pretty reasonable data rate in the uplink, right? Yeah? So in the downlink, we've got quite good data rates today with HSPA. But in the uplink as well, you want to have reasonable data rates. So to start off with, your uplink speed needs to be good enough. So what uplink speeds do we have at the moment? Say in Australia with the 3G network. So quite typically, most operators will say we could peak up to 1 megabit per second or 1.8, but that's shared across an entire number of users, right? But what you'd actually see as a consumer would be significantly less than that. My guess, personal guess, is it's around 64 kilobits per second, maybe up to 128 maximum. It's a lot more expensive in the uplink to create big data pipes, but in the downlink, it's a lot easier. And the reason for that is your mobile phone is the one that's the limiting factor, right? Your mobile base station can afford to deliver high data rates downlink because it has a big, powerful amplifier and has a huge coverage area. Your mobile phone doesn't walk around with a big 20-watt power amplifier, and if it did, it wouldn't be very mobile. So this is one of the key problems. So you're limited intrinsically by your uplink data speed. But even if you were able to get 256 kilobits per second uplink, I think that would probably be fast enough. Because if you think about the pictures that you're storing on your phone, they're probably not more than 500 kilobits in size. So it's quite feasible to see that you could send 10 pictures at a time. So I say the first problem is in terms of uplink data rates. That's starting to get solved now. The second problem is actually probably more related to the mobile operators and their pricing plans. How are they charging you for transferring those types of data in the uplink? That's something to also consider. And the third part is actually ease of use. The actual integration of those applications on your mobile device. How easy is it for you to select 10 or 15 pictures in your phone, press send, and off they go to a friend? If you had to use MMS to do it, you'd have to add the pictures one by one, which is extremely cumbersome, and you'd never do it. So 3 things that need to be in place. The speeds in the uplink. 2, the pricing or commercial model needs to make sense, which is the tariffs. And 3 is the application integration. So those are 3 very important factors that need to be considered. So whenever you're considering multimedia and mobile applications, it's worth having a look at those 3 areas and seeing whether they're actually making sense and actually working. So if we look at the actual device and mobile device application going forward, we started to see this concept of smartphones. So smartphones were then the next level of intelligence, if you like, in a mobile phone. They had everything in it. A high-powered processor, you could do Word and PowerPoint and all those simple things in it. But again, the small screen is a limiting factor. What kind of phones are we going to see going forward? We don't really know yet. I guess the screens are getting bigger and bigger. The big key change is probably the disappearance of the keyboard. and pure touch screen, which allows then the screen to actually become a lot larger. But beyond that, there's nothing revolutionary that we've seen yet. I don't personally have any great ideas on where the next step will be, but I suspect once we get to that step function or that step change, that'll actually create a big shift in the industry as well in terms of usability and take-up. So what we're seeing now, to summarize, is more high data usage from PCMCIA cards and laptops. So as I mentioned before, you put a card in your laptop and you're downloading a significant amount of data. So that's where the data spike is happening at the moment. Most consumers aren't downloading a lot of data to their mobile phone yet, but that's starting to happen with the advances in the phones that we're seeing. But beyond that, nothing new has happened as far as I can see it. So it'd be interesting to see where things play out. So the next slide here is just to remind you that the number of players from a content point of view. So, I mean, this is about services and applications that we're talking about. So on the music side, we've got, all those famous record labels like Sony BMG, EMI, Warner Music, and so on. From a TV and video point of view, there's a number of different firms. News and weather, Bloomberg is a classic one, especially for financial information, and the list just goes on and on and on. But the key problem occurs again in the same way that it did with GPRS when I talked about the walled garden on-net and off-net. If you take a mobile operator, how are they supposed to entice you onto their network? If it comes down to a matter of signing the right commercial agreements with these content providers, how many do they need to sign up with in order to make things exciting for you or compelling for you to get on their network? It could be in the number of thousands. That's very difficult to manage. And some of these firms come and go very quickly. They might survive for 6 months, be a hit, and then everyone gets bored and moves on to something else. So the frequency of these content providers is going to be interesting to watch as well, to see how that plays out. The easiest option, of course, is to have a purely open access network where you can then surf whoever you want, and then you have a relationship with whichever content provider you like. Again, Yahoo or Google or whoever it might be, rather than the operator being the conduit for these services. So if we look at the future landscape and we look at some popular brands here in the Australian context, we've got all types of services like eBay, Yahoo, Domain.com is for property, rentals, and real estate. RSVP is a dating site. Let's pick another one like 9MSN is a popular one. MSN Chat, again, the list goes on and on. But what's interesting here is that we're already starting to see many operators, for example, Three, creating a lot of relationships with a number of different content providers. Yahoo and Channel 7, for example, is another relationship where Channel 7 has tried to provide content through Yahoo. And of course, Channel 9 and MSN was the big one that happened some years ago as well. And many of the traditional newsprint companies and like Fairfax have moved into a purely digital type domain. So they set up a separate business called Fairfax Digital, which is also quite large, offering a number of different services online that are starting to be replicated on the mobile device as well. So moving on then, where do we see all of this coming together? So to start off with, if we look at it from a traffic and revenue point of view, what used to happen in the past was that if we look at the 2G context, as the traffic went up, the revenue went up somewhat proportionally, if you like. So what I mean by that is the more you and I talked on the mobile phones, the more revenue the operator was getting because there was essentially a one-to-one relationship, right? Then more recently, operators introduced these bucket plans or pricing plans, right? Where you'd only pay $50 a month, you'd get a number of different call minutes. So the relationship wasn't exactly one-to-one, if you like. So after your buckets were expired, then you could buy new buckets, for example, and then you'd continue to talk on more and more. So what that meant really was that your spend to the operator was actually quite capped. You were able to reduce your cost, but at the same time, you and I were talking more. Our minutes of use, or MOU, is a metric that is commonly used by operators, increased substantially. So what this meant was that operators were essentially receiving less revenue, but consumers were actually talking more. And if you're talking more, you need to have more capacity in the network, right? More capacity in the network means that you need to build additional hardware and equipment, potentially more base stations, and that means more cost. So this created a big shift for many of the operators, which saw their margins starting to decrease quite fast. So their revenues are going down and their costs are going up, which are heading in opposite directions, less than ideal. And then data started to come along as well. Now, as I mentioned, data was priced per kilobyte or volume, and that was okay at the time because it wasn't being used as much. But again, the same sort of system developed for data, where we would have a bundling kind of concept or a bucket approach. So for 500 megabytes, you'd pay $10 a month, and you could use up to that quota, for example. So when these pricing plan changes happened, we started to see big spikes in the data traffic. So as you can see here, together with the technology shift from 2G to 3G, and it's also important to say, with the change in the tariff plans for mobile operators, we started to see significant growth in the amount of data usage. So to give you some numbers, many operators, like in Western Europe, for example, and in Asia for that matter, in the first 3 to 6 months, their data revenues trebled, So it went up by 300%, which is phenomenal. So if you're in the engineering organization in these telecom operators and you suddenly see this huge spike in data, you need to take care of this capacity and this congestion in an effective way. And it takes time to build out additional capacity and additional coverage to accommodate this spike in data as well. So traffic planning and capacity management became a very big problem for these telecom operators. More so from an engineering perspective. In a telecom operator, what you typically have is two large organizations. One is the engineering organization, and the other is the marketing organization. So the marketing organization is more interested in sales. So from a pricing plan point of view, they'd like to see the pricing plans change, the quotas increase fairly quickly. But it takes a lot longer, of course, to build infrastructure to be ready in preparation for these pricing plans. So many telecom operators face this problem of rapidly changing marketing, if you like, and an engineering organization that was effectively lagging, which proved to be a bit of a problem. And that's still the case today. All right, the next section we're going to move into is multimedia examples. So maybe we could take a break for about 5 minutes. How's that sound? Yeah.